I was standing by the kitchen window on the last evening I spent in the house I had lived in for almost half a century. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long yellow streaks across the driveway, and in that light I watched my daughter loading the final boxes into the trunk of her car. She moved quickly, efficiently, without a single glance toward the window where I stood. I knew she was avoiding my eyes. She had been avoiding them for days. There was a strange stillness in me, the kind that comes only after a person has cried beyond the point of exhaustion. I had shed every tear I had when she told me the truth 3 days earlier. The house was no longer mine. She had sold it. Sold the place where I had cooked thousands of meals, tended a small but stubborn garden, raised 3 children, and said goodbye to the only man I ever loved. She had done it without my permission, without my understanding, without even my awareness. She said it was necessary. She said I could no longer live here safely, that I belonged somewhere supervised, somewhere structured, somewhere designed for the final stretch of life. She insisted it was for my own good and explained that a vehicle would come tomorrow morning to take me to a facility she had chosen. According to her, this was the responsible path, the logical one. In her mind, this was the end of a dangerous phase of denial. In my mind, this was the end of my life as I had known it. I remained at the window long after her car pulled away. The headlights disappeared, the street quieted, and all that remained was the fading warmth of the sun and the growing ache inside my chest. I kept thinking about how an entire lifetime had narrowed into a single decision made by someone I once believed would always protect me. I kept trying to understand how the woman I raised, the child I nursed, soothed, taught, and supported, had decided that removing me from the home I built was not an act of violence, but an act of love. The truth was simple. Somewhere along the path of her adulthood, I had stopped being a mother and had become an inconvenience, an aging responsibility, a problem to be solved. That realization settled into me with the quiet weight of something irreversible. I was 79 years old, and despite my frailty, I could still remember the sharp, bright details of the life I once lived, the life that felt so far away now. I grew up in a small industrial town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everybody else, and where a person's worth was measured by the consistency of their work rather than the size of their dreams. My father worked in a factory. My mother sewed clothes for neighbors to help with the bills. We didn't have much, but we had stability and warmth. It was enough. I met George when I was 20. He was tall, quiet, and kind, with calloused hands and a gentle way of looking at the world. He couldn't build dreams out of poetry, but he could build anything else. Shelves, tables, fences, a life. We married in a small church, with my mother's homemade dress and my father's proud smile. There were no decorations, no elegant invitations, just a few relatives, a cake from the local bakery, and the certainty that we belonged to each other. The house that would later be taken from me came into our lives a year after the wedding. It was old, drafty, and in terrible need of repair. The porch leaned, the roof leaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and I fell in love with it instantly. We poured ourselves into that house. George fixed everything he could get his hands on, and I turned every corner into something warm and welcoming. It was the place where we imagined our whole future. All 3 of our children were born while we lived there. I remembered holding them on that porch in the summer evenings, swaying gently, humming old lullabies my mother once sang to me. Those nights felt endless then. I never thought I would look back on them someday and feel the ache of something lost forever. George and I spent 52 years together. He was never loud or dramatic, never the kind of man who needed to be noticed. But he was constant, the kind of constant that makes the world feel safe. When pancreatic cancer took him in just 4 months, it felt like the earth fell out from under me. I stayed with him through every moment of his illness, the long nights, the whispered fears, the trembling hands. I held him as he slipped away in our bedroom upstairs. The house felt like it cracked open that night, and something cold moved inside it. But I stayed. I stayed, because those walls were the only ones that had ever known our story. After his death, the children drifted even farther from me. They had already moved away years earlier. Careers, marriages, opportunities that grew far beyond this old town. I never blamed them. That's what children do. They leave. But I always believed they carried this house inside them the way I carried them. I believed they understood what it meant to me. Life became harder, slowly, like a tightening thread. My body betrayed me in small, humiliating ways. Aching joints, trembling hands, foggy moments of forgetting what I walked into a room for. I brushed it off as normal aging. But the fall in the bathroom changed everything. I lay on the tile floor for hours before a neighbor found me. My children, especially Caroline, reacted with a surge of urgency, a kind that looked a lot like fear, but felt a lot like frustration. From that point on, they watched me not as a mother, but as a fragile liability. Caroline began visiting more frequently after the fall, arriving every couple of weeks with a notebook in hand and a look that mixed concern with something colder, something calculating. She moved through the rooms with a kind of clinical attention, noticing every speck of dust, every unwashed cup in the sink, every wilted corner of the garden. I felt her silently evaluating me, taking mental notes, not as a daughter, but as someone assessing a situation that needed intervention. I tried to keep up. I pushed myself to clean before she arrived, to cook more often, to stay alert and upright, even when my joints screamed in protest. But the truth followed me everywhere. My body no longer obeyed me the way it once had. One afternoon, she walked in and found me asleep in George's old chair. It had been a brief, unplanned nap, my body simply shutting down for a moment. Yet the expression on her face told me that, to her, it was another sign that I was slipping, failing, losing ground. She saw fragility where I saw only exhaustion, and her conclusions settled over me like a verdict. Soon she began involving others. A woman from social services appeared at my doorstep, asking careful, polite questions that stung more than they reassured. She carried a clipboard and a gentle tone that couldn't hide the fact that she was there to judge whether I could still look after myself. I answered everything clearly, forcing my voice to stay steady, but inside I felt reduced, stripped of dignity, examined like a problem rather than a person. Not long after that, Caroline brought a realtor. She presented it as a simple consultation, nothing more than an informational visit. The realtor wandered through the house, taking notes and photos, talking about the neighborhood, market demand, estimates. I sat in the kitchen and felt a kind of cold dread spreading through me. At that moment, I knew Caroline had already made her decision long before asking for my thoughts. She had begun planning my removal long before she told me anything. I tried to reason with her, to explain what this house meant to me, how every corner held the echo of my life with George, how each creaking board carried memories of my children's laughter. But whenever I spoke, she listened with the distant patience of someone humoring a child. She seemed convinced that practicality outweighed sentiment, that numbers and logistics mattered more than bonds and history. My other children, Tommy and Susan, echoed her perspective from a distance. They told me the same things, using the same tone, as though they had rehearsed together. They insisted that I would be safer in a care facility, that I would have company, that my house required more maintenance than I could manage. Their voices came through the phone with a kind of hollow certainty, and each call deepened the ache in my chest. I realized, slowly and painfully, that they were not asking me. They were informing me. When the word guardianship slipped into one of those conversations, even gently, something inside me broke. The threat didn't come with rage. That might have been easier to understand. Instead, it came wrapped in calmness, presented as a responsible option. I understood then that I was no longer viewed as capable of deciding my own life. They were prepared to take control whether I agreed or not. I began to see the situation with a clarity that felt almost physical. Every reassurance was simply another layer of the same intention. Every visit was an evaluation. Every softened tone carried the weight of a future they had already chosen for me. The house, the heart of my life, had become a line item in a plan I had never approved. The realization hollowed me out. I felt myself shrinking within the walls I had once filled with laughter and movement. I felt myself becoming a guest in my own home. I tried to hold on to routines, to bits of independence, to anything that could make me feel steady. But the pressure continued to grow, subtle and relentless. The world I had built piece by piece over 50 years was slipping away under the well-meaning efficiency of my own children. The day Caroline announced that the house had already been sold marked the final rupture. But the truth was, the breaking had started long before. It had begun the moment she stopped seeing me as a mother and began seeing me as someone who needed to be managed. That shift was the real loss. The sale of the house was only the aftermath. The moment Caroline placed the papers in front of me, my world narrowed into something sharp and unbearable. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who believed she was doing the right thing, while I struggled to understand how every boundary I trusted had dissolved without warning. The pages showed signatures, dates, figures, and a transfer of ownership that had already happened. My name was still printed on the top lines, a relic of a life I no longer controlled. But the space where my permission should have been was replaced by a signature I did not remember giving. The realization settled slowly, like frost moving across glass. When I was in the hospital after my fall, she had placed documents in front of me, insisting they were meant only for paying bills during my recovery. My hands had been weak then, my mind fogged by pain and medication, and I had trusted her without hesitation. That trust had cost me my home. I felt a deep tremor moving through me, the kind that rises not from anger but from devastation. Caroline explained the legal logic behind it, the necessity, the urgency, the practicality of the choice she had made. She spoke with a tone that suggested inevitability, as though the matter had been decided long before I ever knew there was a decision to make. The distance between us, mother and daughter, stretched into something unrecognizable. What broke me was not only the sale itself, but the ease with which she moved past the emotional wreckage it caused. She spoke about the facility that awaited me, about safety and supervision, about specialists and structure. But none of it softened the truth that she had already chosen my future without involving me. In her eyes, the decision was logical. In mine, it was a quiet erasure of the life I had built. For the next 3 days, the house turned into a place of mourning. I wandered through each room as if it were a graveyard of the life I had lived. I touched the walls George had painted with his own hands, still remembering the scent of the fresh coat that once filled the tiny living room. I opened closets containing dresses I had worn to birthdays, graduations, and evenings that had long since faded. I held the old baking dish where I had prepared every Thanksgiving meal for a family that now saw me as a burden. Every object whispered memories I wasn't ready to let go of. Caroline, on the other hand, moved with brisk efficiency. She opened drawers, sorted items into boxes, discarded what she considered unnecessary. She evaluated my possessions with the practicality of someone clearing out a storage unit rather than a home pulsing with history. Her movements were clean, quick, almost businesslike. She believed she was being helpful. She believed she was doing what needed to be done. But with every item removed, a piece of my life seemed to vanish. She selected only a few belongings for me to take to the facility, things she felt were essential. She said the room there would be small, that space was limited, that personal items had to be kept to a minimum. She placed my clothes in a plain box, folded neatly, but she left behind George's belongings. The watch he loved, the book he read every winter, the photos of us when we were young, all deemed unnecessary, all destined for storage or disposal. As I moved from room to room, the house grew emptier, and so did I. On the last night, I sat in George's old chair for hours, unable to sleep. The quiet around me felt heavy, as if the house itself understood it was being abandoned. I remembered the early days when George and I had scrubbed the floors, painted the walls, and planted the apple tree in the yard. I remembered the children running down the stairs on Christmas mornings. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, arguments, reconciliations, every heartbeat of a family that once felt whole. That night, I said goodbye to all of it within the privacy of my own heart. The morning of my departure began in a blur. A transport van arrived, and I watched as my remaining boxes, the few belongings Caroline had chosen for me, were loaded. When I stepped outside, I turned to face the house one final time. The porch, where I had once rocked my children to sleep. The window of the bedroom where George had taken his last breath. The garden where we had spent countless spring afternoons planting and tending to small things that grew only because we cared for them. The vehicle pulled away, and the house slipped from view, taking with it every chapter of a life I thought I had earned the right to keep. The facility was everything I feared it would be: clean, well-organized, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. The hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic. The floors shined with the artificial gleam of maintenance. My room was small, barely large enough to hold the few items I had been allowed to bring. A single bed, a narrow dresser, a window overlooking a parking lot. The silence there was different from the silence of my home. At home, the silence held memories. Here, it held nothing. Caroline helped me place a few photographs on the dresser, straightened my bedspread, spoke in a tone she likely believed was reassuring, and then she left. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that pierced something deep inside me. For days afterward, I moved as though underwater. I followed routines, swallowed pills, sat through mealtimes, and drifted in and out of long stretches of stillness. The hollow inside me was vast. It felt as though my life had been packed into those boxes, and everything that didn't fit had simply been erased. The first weeks inside the facility drifted by like indistinct days of winter, each one blending into the next. I moved through the routines expected of me, sitting where I was told to sit, eating what was placed in front of me, allowing nurses to remind me of medications I had once been perfectly capable of managing alone. My thoughts often wandered back to my home, to the life that had been taken from me with such swift decisiveness. I felt as though I had been set aside, placed in a quiet corner of life, where aging mothers were stored once their usefulness had passed. The world outside continued with its noise and movement, but mine had shrunk to the confines of a room no bigger than a large closet. The only window offered a glimpse of cars and pavement, a reminder that life went on just within reach, yet entirely out of my control. For a long time, I felt hollow, not angry, not even grieving, just emptied out. Then something shifted, and it happened so quietly that I almost didn't notice. It began with small details. Another resident sitting in the hallway with her knitting basket each morning, a man in a wheelchair who greeted everyone passing by, a nurse who lingered for a moment longer than necessary just to ask if I had slept well. These moments didn't feel like comfort at first. They simply existed, appearing around me like distant points of light in a dark room. One morning, the woman with the knitting basket motioned gently toward the chair beside her. Her hands moved slowly, gracefully, as she worked through the loops of a scarf she had been making for weeks. I hesitated, then sat down. She began showing me how her fingers moved, guiding the yarn, forming the patterns. My hands trembled too much to follow at first, but she didn't seem bothered. She continued, steady and calm, filling the silence between us with small pieces of her life. Her story reminded me of my own: a long marriage, a quiet home, children who had grown distant, loss upon loss, until she too had found herself in one of these rooms, wondering when exactly she had stopped belonging to the world outside. Listening to her, I felt something loosen in my chest. It occurred to me that I was not alone in this strange, painful transition. Many of us had been pushed along a path we didn't choose, guided by the anxious hands of children who believed they were saving us, even while they erased the homes that carried the stories of our lives. Over time, I began to sit with her regularly, then with others, at meals, in the common room, during slow afternoon walks through the small courtyard. Each person carried memories that were both unique and painfully familiar. Stories of houses sold, belongings discarded, decisions made without their voices. I realized that this place, though stripped of the texture of real living, held a quiet community of people who understood one another in a way our families no longer did. Little by little, I found myself stepping out of the numbness, not into joy, that would have been too much to hope for, but into something more grounded. I started writing in a small notebook a nurse had given me. I wrote about George, about the way the porch looked in late summer rain, about Caroline's laughter as a child, about the life I had lived in that house. Not because I thought anyone would read it, but because the act of writing felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been nearly erased. I began to feel the weight inside me shifting, still heavy, but no longer suffocating. Caroline continued to call once a week, speaking with the same measured tone she had adopted throughout the entire ordeal. I answered her questions, told her about the routine of my days, and allowed her to believe that everything had settled. In truth, I no longer felt the same sharp betrayal each time her name appeared on the caller ID. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind an ache that felt less destructive and more instructive. I understood something I hadn't been willing to admit before. My children had acted not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of loss, fear of responsibility, fear of witnessing the slow decline of the woman who had once been unshakable in their eyes. Understanding didn't erase the damage. It didn't restore my home. It didn't undo the theft of my autonomy. But it allowed me to breathe without bitterness. The truth became clear in time. My home had been taken, but myself had not. My memories remained mine. My love for George remained untouched. My identity, though shaken, was still built from everything I had survived, not everything I had lost. I learned to find small comforts. The rhythm of knitting needles in the hallway, the shy smile of a resident who rarely spoke, the quiet hum of the building at night, the warm sun through my window on certain afternoons. Life became smaller, yes, but not lifeless. On certain evenings, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned rose-colored, I would picture the old house. I imagined strangers living there now, filling the rooms with their voices, replacing my memories with new ones of their own. And instead of pain, I felt a faint sense of hope that the house might once again shelter laughter and life. I no longer possessed the walls that once held my stories, but I still possessed the stories themselves. And that, I realized, was enough. As long as I could honor the life I lived, even from within these narrow walls, I had not been erased. I was still here, still remembering, still feeling, still alive. And even in a place I never chose, surrounded by people who carried their own quiet wounds, I found something like dignity waiting for me. Not in the room itself, but in the simple act of surviving what was meant to diminish me. Every morning when I opened my eyes and greeted another day, it felt like a quiet victory.